Okay, so I was talking to Oregon Restore Tools yesterday, and we got on the topic of grinding, like the edges and stuff on axes and knives and whatnot. And I mentioned a knife grind, and he wasn't familiar with it. And when we got talking about it, we are like, I wonder if other people are kind of in the same boat. So I'm going to give you guys like a really quick crash course on basic knife grinds and stuff like that, and kind of their use. And I have a whole bunch of examples to kind of give you guys an idea. First things first, we're going to talk about the anatomy, just so we're all talking about the same things. So this picture is if you were looking at the knife like so. Okay, so the blade spine is at the bottom. This dotted line is the axis of symmetry. Knives, when they're ground and classified, is based on the primary bevel or the grind. So this particular one is a full flat grind, which means these shoulders on the side here are ground flat. And then at the tip is a secondary bevel or a micro bevel, which is the actual cutting edge part of the knife. Okay, so most secondary bevels have either a V grind or a convex. Now, convex looks like a parabola. This is what a convex edge looks like, but it's rounded all the way to the point. There is no actual like V shape or wedge at the tip. Convex is an old school knife sharpener's setup. I'll explain that in a minute. But secondary bevels, if you guys are using jig systems like Lansky's or Worksharp, you end up with something akin to a V grind secondary bevel. If you're a hand sharpener, unless you are perfect and I'm not, you end up with something in the idea of a convex, which is mostly, instead of it being perfect flat slopes for the primary edge, everything has a slight curve. Now, full flat grind is like what's on this Spyderco Sage 2. So it's got flat sides on it, and then I have a secondary bevel on this one. This particular one, I actually ground, sharpened it down to have a convex secondary bevel. So this doesn't have a V grind, it's got a sloped grind. Whereas this Marbles here has a convex grind. And the difference between these two in appearance is that this one is ground flat, this one is ground on a slack belt, so this actually has a very, very slight curve. And then the slope gets more, less and less slope, or the angle gets bigger as you get closer to the edge. Functionally, to me, there is really not a whole lot of difference between a full convex, and then a full flat grind with a convex secondary bevel, because the shape of them is really very, very similar. And that is like that. So if you're talking about convex versus full flat grind, this is a convex edge on the left, full flat grind on the right, with a V grind secondary. And if you were to knock that shoulder off and turn it into a curve, functionally it's very, very similar to a convex grind. I like convex for hand sharpening. It's tough to get used to with a stone. A lot of guys will use sandpaper and stuff like that. But the sharpening is a whole nother can of worms. So we've gone through convex and full flat grind. One of the best slicers is the hollow grind. That one right there. So what they do is they use a big wheel, and they actually grind concave sides into that bevel. Makes an excellent, excellent slicer. Saber grind is one of the tougher ones, and this one is, I think this is a little bit hollow, but this is the concept of it. So instead of going all the way to the top of the spine here, they only ground about halfway, and then they put a secondary bevel on it as well. It gets kind of a gray area if this shoulder comes back and back and back further when it becomes a flat grind and no longer a saber. Semantics. But by and large, about halfway forward is a saber, and then halfway back is more or less a full flat grind, or it's like 3/4 flat, whatever. Scandi is what most of you guys with the bushcraft knives and stuff, that's what you guys know, which doesn't have a secondary bevel. It is just like a V. It's like a wood chisel. These are awesome for working with soft woods, but depending on the steel, these have a tendency to chip or roll when you're working with hardwood. I like this grind, but I have a problem with, because all the wood I use outside is hardwood, so I struggle with these, keeping a good edge. What I have done instead on my knife is the Scandivex here. So I've seen before where people talk about Scandivex, and a lot of times they mean either convexing the secondary edge, so they'll actually round the very edge off, or they'll round the shoulders, or a combination of the two, which is what I did with my Battle Horse feather stick. So I actually rounded the shoulders a little bit to make it a little bit smoother to cut with, and I rounded the secondary bevel. This makes it a little bit tougher in hardwood, and I do better feather sticking and fine woodworking with a convex edge versus a Scandi. I tend to dig in with a Scandi too much. Now, what does this all mean? Really, use what works for you, use what you like. As a general rule of thumb, one of the tougher ones is a saber, followed by like a really thick full flat grind. They're the toughest because there's like the most material there. They also tend to be really, really good batoning splitters and stuff because the shoulders here make a better wedge than, say, a Scandi or a hollow grind. There's not enough meat behind the edge, which is what they say. When somebody says behind the edge, they're talking about this material directly behind the secondary bevel. So there's more edge, there's more meat behind this edge versus the hollow. Convex is kind of a jack of all trades. This is what the old-time knife makers used to use all the time, and it really does make super, super nice edges, but it is difficult to sharpen. If you can handle that, use sandpaper or something of the sort, strops, and don't damage the blade, you can get a lot of serviceability out of a convex. The sliciest is the hollow grind because there's by and large the least amount of material behind the shoulder. Soft woodworking, I give that to the Scandi because it's just like a wood chisel. Hard woodworking, I would say the full flat grind or the convex because it has a fine point, but it also has more material behind the shoulder than, say, the Scandi. So it's a little more resistant to the harder woods. A saber, if you were to knock the shoulders off of a saber on the primary and the secondary bevel, excuse me, you would end up with something akin to a very fat convex as well, which that would work pretty well for hard woodworking. Now, when it comes to axes, there is, from what I can see, there's kind of about 3 of them that most of the guys sharpen with. The really, really good ones will do like a full convex. So what they'll do is they'll try to get like a 24-degree angle up here at the secondary for your cutting edge, and then they round this part at like a 20, give or take. I try to follow something similar to this in my sharpening on the axes. If you are just hogging material away and using files and stuff, or you see old axes, they tend to look like this, where it's a flat shoulder and then they've got some kind of a secondary edge up here. Sometimes this shoulder right here will be knocked down, but that's by and large, I mean, either one of these are perfectly serviceable. And then carving axes tend to have a Scandi grind. So that's a pure wedge shape at the edge. There's no secondary bevel like on these other ones. Well, a full convex doesn't have a secondary because it's one long line. But for something like this, there's no secondary like this. These work good on softwoods and stuff. I have no experience using a Scandi grind on hardwood, like for hewing and stuff. So you'd have to ask somebody else. I always use something more akin to this for my stuff. But yeah, holy cow, 9 minutes and 15 seconds. So yeah, this was definitely longer than I intended, but there was more information than I thought. So cool, there you go, guys. Enjoy.